Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first official episode of the Sisterhood of the Rose podcast. I'm your co-host, Jess.
And I'm your co-host, Lily.
And we are so excited to be here to be sharing this beautiful new creation with you. And we really just wanted to dive into the origins of it, how we met, where the idea for the Sisterhood of the Rose came from, what our intentions are for the podcast, and set the foundation for it for you as our listeners and really just what we want to create here. So we'll just dive right in. We're going to start with Lily. She's going to touch on how we met.
Yes. Wow. It was, gosh, I don't even know how many months ago now that it was, but probably close to 6. I was scrolling on Instagram, watching people's stories, and I happened to see Jess's podcast basically advertised by another woman that I follow. And this woman had been featured on the podcast, and I was really intrigued by the name of Jess's podcast. So for those of you who weren't following Jess's podcast before, her podcast was named Journey In. And something about that name just really spoke to me. And I immediately reached out. I just immediately reached out to her and introduced myself, said hi, that I was really intrigued by the name of her podcast and was really potentially excited about being featured on the podcast myself, as I am a business owner running my own energy healing coaching work, small business. And Jess was super responsive to me. I would say we hit it off pretty right away for the most part.
Yeah.
And yeah. And Jess asked me to meet with her first to share a little bit about what I did, because I was a literal complete stranger. And so we got on and I shared what I do in my business, and we talked about what would be interesting for her audience to discuss with me. And her audience was very spiritually oriented. And so we ended up taking the route of energy healing work and just setting a foundation for her audience around what that is. And that was really great for me. I loved recording with Jess, and we had so much fun. And I feel like the podcast episode that we released, that first one we ever did, was just so educational for people. And I think that Jess got a lot of great feedback around that too. And from there, we kind of kept in touch a little bit. I actually ended up interviewing Jess on her podcast, letting her have a chance to share a little bit of her story. And from there, it just kind of developed into more of a friendship. And Jess ended up asking me to be a co-host.
Yes, it happened super organically, which I think is really great. And what is also really synchronistic about that whole story is that before you reached out to me, I actually had set the intention that I wanted to have an energy healer on my podcast. And then it was like the next week you were in my DMs, and I was like, okay, you can't make this shit up. So I was super excited to have you on. And then, yeah, like you said, we just hit it off, and we message each other almost every single day. So it's just been a really beautiful unfolding. And, now we're obviously co-hosts, but we're also friends, which I think makes it really special. And so from there, so as you mentioned, I had my own podcast, Journey In. For those listening, you may have come from there. But when I was starting my podcast, I remember I was on this walk. I started it in, I think, November of 2022. Yeah, 2022. And I was on this walk, and I had this like super intense desire for a co-host. And I remember I was kind of talking with my guides a little bit like on the walk, and I was just like, oh, I have this like intense desire in my heart to have a co-host. Like I want it so bad. And I was really feeling into the podcast, and I was like, this feels so aligned though. Like it feels good. It feels good for me to start putting myself out there in this way. But that's the one thing that was missing. And there was truly no one in my life at the time that I felt aligned with to ask to co-host. And so then there's that piece. So I've always wanted a co-host, truly. And then when I met Lily, it was really after I had her on the podcast, on my podcast, to interview me, and just seeing how eloquent she was with the interviewing, and just also our dynamic, and just how we got along, the energy between us. I was like, wow, okay, there's something here. And then I started doing manifestation work, and I was like, I really want to co-host. Like the desire like resurfaced for me. Of It was always there, but it like came really up to the forefront around having a co-host. And I was sitting on my couch doing a meditation around around my manifestation work. And the message, I don't know if it was my guides or what, but it was like, reach out to Lily, reach out to Lily, ask her to be your co-host. And I was like, that's crazy though. Like, we don't know each other at the time. We didn't know each other super well. We know each other a lot better now. But I was like, what if she says no? I was scared shitless. It felt like I was asking someone out on a date. And I was like, I don't know. But it happened in actually multiple meditations that they were telling me. And so finally I was like, okay, if I want a co-host, I'm gonna have to take some aligned action around this. And it feels right with Lily. So, oh, and I was seeing your name everywhere. Your name and like the actual flower lilies were just, it was all around me. Anyways. So I reached out to Lily and I was like, hey, would you be interested in starting a podcast together and co-hosting? And she was like, well, what would that entail? And so anyways, we jumped on a call, we talked about what it would look like, and Lily was like, yeah, I want to do this. And so here we are. And that's really how it all began. And so it definitely was divinely led, which I think is really beautiful. And I mean, we were brought together for a reason. We've really realized that. So we are just so excited to be here and to be sharing our journeys with you all together. Lily and I just have a lot of very similar opinions and viewpoints and perspectives, I would say, on the spiritual space. And so, yeah, we're going to bring it to the podcast.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that, because I knew some of that, but I didn't know that you were seeing my name that much, or even with the flower. Maybe you mentioned that, but it wasn't something that I, totally remembered. So thanks for sharing. And yeah, I mean, it was totally divinely led. And I think that on my end, receiving the invitation, I tend to be pretty specific with collaborations. That's just kind of like how I operate best. And it felt so right. And I was like, oh, okay. And it was kind of one of those moments where it's in alignment and you're like, wow, so that's what alignment feels like. That feels really good. That feels really exciting. So I was just so excited to get started. And she actually asked me when I was in Europe on a trip. And so we had to kind of postpone our decision-making process and jumping into everything until I got back. But it was such an expansive trip. And then getting that invitation while I was there was just even more special.
I totally forgot you were in Europe when I asked.
Yeah.
Actually, I
Yeah.
do remember that because I was like, oh, but she's traveling. But it was coming through so intensely in my meditations that I was just like, I just need to do this. I just need to reach out.
Yeah, exactly. So glad you did. And here we are. And like Jess said, we were both on this spiritual journey, and something that we have come together so much on is our journey individually and collectively now, and our own processes, thoughts, beliefs, learnings, exploration around the spiritual space, and just living a soul-led life. And that's really what we want to bring to this podcast. And you might hear things that maybe you don't hear in other spiritual spaces, and that's great. We're just adding to the flavor of what the spiritual journey can look like for you. And on some level, we hope that you resonate with the content in a way that feels good for you. And at the same time, we always encourage you to find your own truth. So today, we are just introducing ourselves so that you feel a connection to us, and building a connection with you is really important to us. So one other thing that we wanted to talk about today was the name of our podcast. So, the name of our podcast is very, very special. And I would just encourage you to reflect on what you initially felt when you saw the name Sisterhood of the Rose. To me, it's very delicate, as Jess and I were discussing yesterday, actually, and it's very feminine. But there's a lot of history behind it. There's a lot to the Sisterhood of the Rose. You can go on for ages researching this because there is so much out there in terms of the actual history, the interpretations of the Sisterhood of the Rose, the documentation of the Sisterhood of the Rose. It's an ancient lineage. And I want to share a little bit around how this actually came through, like the name, because to be honest, this was a big hold up for Jess and I in creating this podcast. We knew what we wanted to talk about really quickly. We knew what kind of content we wanted to create pretty quick, but it was the name to really describe the essence of what we want to share and really the foundation of what we want to share that it threw us for a loop a little bit. The name came through for me a couple months into the process of us creating the podcast, and not super long after we tried to find the name. It wasn't actually super long after that the name came to me, but it took us a while to accept it because it does have a lot of gravity behind it. And it took, we needed some time to feel into it individually, both of us feel into it, and to see if that really was the right fit. Because, like I said, this is not just some name we made up. This is something that has a lot of meaning behind it. So I'll just share how the name came to me. I have been using Rebecca Campbell's Work Your Light Oracle deck since I started my spiritual journey. And that deck is so special to me because it was my first ever deck, and it has been so loyal to me. Just has answered all of my frivolous worries. It's been with me since the start. And, we'll get into spiritual tools on this podcast, I'm sure. So don't need to go into that right now. But this deck is important to me and has been with me for a while. And I was pulling around the podcast specifically and just feeling into the energy of the podcast, seeing what was going to come through around it. And the Sisterhood of the Rose card kept coming up. And it kind of hit me as, could that be the name of the podcast? And the Sisterhood of the Rose was actually one of the first messages I ever received in an energy healing myself from a healer. And she also had this deck and she pulled this card for me. And so as I started pulling this card around the podcast, I started to feel into the potential of the name. And as I felt into that, I was like, oh, wow. There was something very profound and very delicate and very high frequency around the potential of the name as the Sisterhood of the Rose. And it's funny because I never would have even really considered that combination of words to be the name of a podcast. I never would have really considered that before, but because that card kept coming up, I floated it by Jess. And from what I remember, and you can elaborate on this too, Jess, obviously, I felt like it was in resonance for you pretty much right away. Was that your experience?
Yeah, it was immediate. It was a full body yes. And it kind of threw me for a loop because I didn't know a whole lot about the Sisterhood of the Rose lineage. Roses have come through quite a bit for me in my spiritual journey in energy healing sessions and whatnot. But yeah, it was an immediate in my body. Whoa. It was kind of like a stop in my tracks. Like I kind of got knocked out of breath.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When I hit on the name part of it, like, oh, this isn't just the essence of the podcast, this could be actually the name. It felt like a really big opening, and just energetics are sometimes really hard for me to explain because they're feelings, but that's what I could say. There's a lot of gravity, a lot of opening, a lot of just really high frequency. And I think that Jess and I actually really needed to take time to start to adopt the name fully because it was really an initiatory process for both of us. adopting a name like that is not something that you do lightly. At least we don't. And so for us, it meant a lot. And we both had to kind of consider whether or not we were ready to be the co-host of a podcast that was named that has such a, feminine quality to it, that is so ancient, that's so loving and all encompassing as the rose truly is. And so, yeah, it took us a little bit of time to come to that. And I remember getting a visual when I was kind of in this space of getting ready, where it was just needing to leap and needing to just jump into the frequency and kind of rip off all the resistance and just jump into it. And eventually that's exactly what we did. And so, just to share a little bit around the Sisterhood of the Rose and what that is, I can read a little excerpt from the card itself from Rebecca Campbell's deck. The Sisterhood of the Rose is a lineage of priestesses and mystics who devoted their lives to serving humanity and seeding light consciousness all over the earth. A cross section of ancient lineages, it is the path of devotion and beauty. So there are a lot of other kind of components to this, but one thing that really speaks to us around the sisterhood is when she says, "You are being called to spend more time in nature, as all the ancient secrets live there. Mother Earth is constantly whispering." We really feel like this has a deep kind of earth connection within the podcast itself too. And the way that that is going to be manifested, we have yet to see. There's so much that we're still waiting for things to unfold within this. So we're just excited to be on the journey.
Yeah, wow, so beautifully said. And yeah, just as Lily said, it took us so much time to sit with it because it was truly and is still an initiation for both of us. And it's something that we're stepping into, and we take it very, very, we hold it very sacred. It's very sacred to, I know, to both of us. And so again, it wasn't a name that we created, but it was the name that came forward for us. And so we do want to hold it in the highest regard that we possibly can. And since then, we've received I mean, we were in this limbo phase of, I feel like we were kind of like, are we worthy of this name? Like, what? Like,
Yeah.
and that's really, I mean, we were taking it real seriously. And
Yeah.
we were just getting signed. I mean, we're not even going to go into it because the signs that we were receiving were every single day, just wild, truly wild. And
Yes.
the one thing that I do want to mention though is both Lily and I were in a grid working group around connecting more deeply with Mother Earth, and it was led by one of our spiritual mentors, we can definitely call her, who we both regard so highly. And on one of the calls, and it was a group there, so there were other members as well as a group setting. On one of the calls, she said everyone in this group is of the Rose lineage. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
And we were sitting there and we were like, and then she pulled a rose card from her oracle deck. And this was before we knew that this was going to be the name, but this was before we fully were like, all right, we're stepping up, where we are accepting this as our name and we are going to step up to it. So
Yeah.
that's the one thing that I felt really called to share. So anyways, we're so grateful that this is the name that wanted to come forward. And do you want to share, this was the icing on the cake, like cherry on top was when we were on our call and you did the oracle card pull.
Yes. Okay. Oh my God. Okay. So first of all, when you said we accept the name, whoa. Okay. That. So just making a note there. But yeah, so we were brainstorming. We were on a planning call, and I had felt the need to tune in to, I don't want to call it a problem, but it was a little bit of a problem. We were like, okay, we have this great podcast. We know it's great, but we need a name. Like, it can't be nameless. And I felt really called to tune into it, but I really wanted to do it with Jess present, because just feeling into the dynamic and the energy can change things. So I ended up doing a card pull at the end of our brainstorm with Jess, and we did it with the Oracle deck that I'm speaking about, the Worker Light Oracle by Rebecca Campbell. And like I said, I have a very deep connection with this deck, and it's almost like having a conversation, very much so, with this deck when I use it at this point. And so I started, and I've never actually done it in front of anyone with this deck specifically. And so I was just, yeah, it was a different experience for me, but I'm so glad that Jess was the one to receive it. And since it was about us, I really wanted it to be, a collective energy type of thing. And so I started pulling around it. And the first card that I pulled was yes, just the yes card.
And didn't
And
the description say just say yes?
yes, it said just say yes. And what I had asked the deck was not even specifically around the name, it was just about the podcast. It was like, show us what we need to know about the podcast. And the first card that we pulled was just say yes. And we both knew at that point what was being referred to. And then we continued to have a few more pulls, and all of the cards that we pulled were just in alignment with what we originally thought. With this deck, it'll lead me to my truth, the truth. And then when I find the truth, when I say it out loud, then the confirmation will come. And that's exactly what happened. It kind of led us to our truth. And then I said, okay, we're doing it. The Sisterhood of the Rose is the name. Give me confirmation. And the next card I pulled was Sisterhood of the Rose. So that was just so magical to do in live time with Jess and I on the call, and really just eliminated any doubt that we had before and allowed us to really just move forward with this.
Yeah, it was truly the icing on the cake. Like of all the cards in the deck, that was the one that you pulled specifically after you said that. So that was our official, after that we were like, this is it. And here we are. So yeah, we're just really excited to be sharing this with all of you. And the Sisterhood of the Rose frequency, we think, is like really embedded into the podcast. And so we're really excited for our listeners to be able to receive that as well. And we kind of touched on it briefly, but we did just want to get into our intentions for the podcast overall, just so that you guys know where we're headed. And we don't totally know where we're headed, right? This is going to evolve as we go. But Lily and I, we are very passionate about our spirituality, about our spiritual journeys. And the one thing that we both really want to bring forward is this realness and this authenticity behind a spiritual journey. And that's really the essence of it all. And also to really, really help you come into empowerment. That is, at least for me, very, very big, because ever since I've met Lily, honestly, she's been really helpful in helping me come into deeper empowerment with my spirituality, because the spiritual space, it can be a little distorted, and it can easily, without you even realizing it, you can give your power away in many ways. And so that's also what we really want to encourage anyone listening. And this is something that we hold ourselves to as well, is stepping into that embodiment and really, really igniting the oracle within, and trusting in yourself as your true guide. And so that is really where and what we want to bring to the surface. No matter what we talk about in this podcast, we want you to walk away feeling empowered on your spiritual journey.
Yeah. Wow. I love how you said that, Jess. It is so important for us. And we like to think that we have some experience in this realm. Both of us have been in the spiritual space and the spiritual journey within ourselves and also within other groups and together for quite a few years. And so we have some time banked, and we have a bunch of experiences that we hope will be insightful in some way for you to draw from, and to really just act as that really grounded force of stability and encouragement in everything that we share. And to help you, step into that empowerment piece, because at the end of the day, you are exactly the thing, the person, the everything that you've been looking for. And we hope that you feel that way when you listen to us.
Absolutely. And we will be sharing very authentically. I mean, we're going to share all the ways in which we've stepped out of our empowerment. We'll get into all of that. So we're here for it all. So, Lily, do you want to close with an invitation?
Yes. So we kind of went through this a little bit with the intentions that we set, but we're really just inviting you into our space. And if you're listening to this, we want to just taking a moment to just take a deep breath. And we hope that you walk with us on this journey if it feels aligned and if you feel called. And if you don't, that's totally okay. You'll find your people. But for the people who feel called by this intro episode, we're really inviting you into this space with big open arms. And we want to be in connection with you as well. So we want to have an engaged audience. We want to eventually, hopefully, take questions, do Q&A sessions. That's kind of our vision and our goal for you to really be part of this. And we really want to share our hearts in this way with you. And we hope that it's received in the best way possible. Because for us, this is not just something to do. It feels like a mission for us. And this is very much heart-centered. And I think pushing our edges in certain ways in terms of our vulnerability aspect and just sharing who we really are, being that authentic, trusted source for you in the spiritual space. So that's what we want to invite you into today. And I think that's it.
So, all that being said, we want to welcome you to the Sisterhood of the Rose podcast, and we can't wait to journey with you.